Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be making a simple pet jacket. And this can be made for both cats, dogs, pretty much any pet. And this is because I designed the pattern in a way that you can adjust it to match your pet's exact measurements, giving you a perfect fit. But we'll get more into the fitting once we get started. And this pattern is on the easier side, so if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem following the easy step-by-step tutorial. With all that being said, grab that PDF pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you'll need 3/4 of a yard to 1 yard for your main fabric. And this really can be a range of different fabrics because it's gonna be based on how you wanna make this jacket. If you wanna make it more of a cozy hoodie, you'll wanna lean more towards a knit fabric, something like a fleece or a sweatshirt fleece. If you wanna make it more like a jacket or a little raincoat, you're gonna wanna go towards something that's either waterproof or a canvas denim or twill. And that's the cool thing about this pattern is that you can go both ways with it. So if you wanna make something more seasonal base, you can totally do that. I'm actually going to be using a very thin water resistant fabric. I'm trying to make mine more like a rain jacket for the spring, but like always, get creative with it. Use the fabric that's going to work best for the season you're currently in. You'll need 3/4 to 1 yard for your secondary fabric, and this is more based on what fabric you chose for your main fabric. If you chose a knit fabric, I would just reuse that same knit fabric for your secondary fabric, but if you chose something more like a canvas denim twill or something like I'm using, then I would recommend using a lightweight nylon fabric, and that's exactly what I'm going to be using. I found this was a great fabric if you're trying to go in the direction of a raincoat, so just keep in mind you're going to want to base this secondary fabric on your main fabric. You'll need up to 10 inches of Velcro, and this is going to be for the main closures up in front and on bottom. And you could go more because the idea of this closure is that you overlap it, so you're going to want to make it so that way you can overlap it if you plan on making this for 2 different animals. But if you're only making this jacket for 1 animal and the size is precise, then you can really reduce the amount of Velcro. As far as the width goes, I recommend going anywhere from 1 inch to 1.5 inch width. You'll need 1 yard of cord or drawstring, and this is optional. And this is gonna be to cinch the hood. And I know sometimes this can get in the way for a pet, so a lot of people will just opt out of this in general. I wanted to throw this detail in because I really like the way it looks, but it's not that useful. Also, going along with that drawstring, you'll need 2 cord stoppers and 2 eyelets. Again, these are optional, so if you don't wanna add the drawstring in the hood, you don't have to get these supplies. You'll need 2 to 4 snap buttons. This will be used for the hood, the pocket, and the leash opening. You can pretty much use any style of snap button, whatever one that's gonna go best with the look of the jacket. And I'm just gonna be using standard snap buttons that come in a kit with multiple finishes. They're super easy to install and they look really nice. Lastly, you'll need your pattern, and this pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is download it, print it off, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And after you print it off, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is going to allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And when it comes to choosing the size, you want to get it kind of close, a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. I prefer to go a tad bit smaller because with this design you overlap the straps so you can adjust that Velcro, and then you can also take those straps out or in. Because with animals, they're all different sizes, so you're never gonna actually get a perfect small, medium, large, extra large. You're just gonna have to go off the measurements and work from there. And that's what I did with this pattern. I made it super easy for you to pick a size and then fine tune that size to your exact measurements. Once you decide on that size, there is a page chart so you don't have to print off the entire pattern because there are a lot of pages. So this allows you to print only the pages necessary to keep down on paper and ink. This pattern is based on 3 basic measurements, that's neck, girth, and length, and I'm going to quickly walk you through how to measure your pet for the best results. The first measurement is neck, and that's exactly what it sounds like. You measure around your animal's neck at the base. After measuring, I typically add 1 inch to the neck because I don't want it to be too tight. Next we have girth, and this measurement is going to go around the body at the high point of the chest. Just like in the last measurement, feel free to add an extra inch so the end product is not too tight on your pet. The last measurement is length. We're going to start at the base of the neck and measure all the way back to the center of the back leg. You can make it shorter or longer, and we'll get more into that once we start cutting the pattern. But a good target to measure to is the center of the back legs. After acquiring the measurements, my dog fell in between medium and large. This type of thing happens all the time, and that's why I can't really buy clothing at stores because my dog is a little bit taller and a little bit skinny. So standard manufacturing sizes just don't work. Since my dog is on the skinnier side, I'm going to go with the medium. And this is something to keep in mind because the length is very easy to change, but the girth is a little bit more tricky, so you're going to want to go on that bigger side just to play it safe. Also keep in mind the straps can overlap anywhere from 4 to 10 inches, so you can make up a lot of girth just in the straps alone. So that's something to keep in mind for the neck and girth measurements. Moving on, since I went with the medium size, I only had to print out the pages 1 through 4, 10 through 16, and 26. And trust me, doing it this way, printing out just the size you need will save you a lot of ink and paper. And if you're not confident on the size, I'm going to show you how to adjust it in later steps. After printing out your pattern and cutting the top and side edges, you're going to overlap those pages, tape the pattern together in alphanumerical order, and you should be good to go. Always check your printer alignment for the best possible results. From here, we're going to cut on the outside of the black line. After cutting out all of your pattern pieces, you should end up with 2 pocket flat panels, 1 out of your secondary fabric and 1 out of your main fabric. 2 pocket panels, 1 out of your secondary fabric and 1 out of your main fabric. 2 leash cover panels, 1 out of your secondary fabric and 1 out of your main fabric. 2 middle hood panels, 1 out of your secondary fabric and 1 out of your main fabric. 4 hood panels, 2 out of your secondary fabric and 2 out of your main fabric. 4 stomach strap panels, 2 out of your secondary fabric and 2 out of your main fabric. And lastly, 2 main panels, 1 out of your secondary fabric and 1 out of your main fabric. Keep in mind this panel is cut on the fold, and this is to ensure you have a perfectly symmetrical panel after you cut it. Before we jump into the construction, I want to quickly run you through a few different techniques on adjusting this pattern to your pet's measurements. The first measurement we're going to look at is the neckline, and it's super simple to make this adjustment. All you have to do is extend it out further or shorten it. As you can see, I extended mine out a little bit further to give me a larger circumference. If your pet is in between sizes, I recommend going a little bit bigger because it's always easy to trim it back. Next, we're going to be taking a look at adjusting the strap width and girth. To make adjustments here, you will need to grab the stomach strap panel. There's 2 different things you can do here. You can adjust the width or you can adjust the length. If you're trying to adjust the girth, what you're going to want to do is extend or shorten your stomach strap panel. Doing this will either tighten it up or make it larger. As far as the width goes, feel free to play around with it, but if you adjust one side, you have to do the exact thing to the opposite side, or else the panels will not line up when it comes time to sewing them together. Keep in mind these strap panels do overlap, so you still have a little bit of wiggle room if the sizing isn't exactly right. Moving on to the last adjustment, and that's going to be the length. This is actually the easiest one to adjust, and probably the most useful because you don't want this too long on your pet or too short on your pet, so adjusting this is very easy to do. Whether you're adding or subtracting to the back edge, the main goal is to keep it in line before it gets to the stomach strap panel. So say I'm adding or subtracting 2 inches to the length, I want to taper it back in before it gets to that stomach strap panel. If you find yourself going too far in, you're going to want to move to the next size. More than likely this won't happen because small adjustments to these panels really make for a big difference. I do recommend fine-tuning the pattern to your pet's measurements because it's going to make for an actual fitting jacket way better than any mass-manufactured generic sizes you're going to find at the store. But don't overthink it because this is a super simple design and you can always adjust it later down the road. Moving on to construction, we're going to start by grabbing our main panel and the stomach strap panels. For this first step, we only need the main fabric, so you can place a secondary fabric off to the side. Same goes for the main panel. Place the secondary fabric off to the side and move down towards the strap connection. Before we start sewing, you're going to want to make sure you have the correct orientation for the strap, and you can check this by lining up the outside curves on both panels. Place the right sides of the stomach strap panel to the right sides of the main panel, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, fold the panel flat to see if the curved edges line up. If everything is looking good, we're going to fold that seam allowance so it's facing towards the center of the main panel and add a top stitch. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Top stitching does add a lot to the final product. It adds strength and overall just a better look. But if it's not the look you're going for, you can skip the top stitching. Double check both sides. If everything is looking good, we can place this panel off to the side and grab the main panel secondary fabric. Lay the panel out flat with right sides facing up, grab the stomach strap panel, and this is going to be the secondary fabric. Place the right sides of the panels together, stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and essentially we're doing the same thing we just did, but for the secondary fabric. Fold the seam allowance towards the center main panel and add a top stitch. Just like in the previous step with the main fabric, double check the outside edges, make sure everything is lined up and looking good. Place this panel off to the side and grab your hood panel. Same goes for the hood panel. We're going to start with just the main fabric, so place the secondary fabric off to the side. Locate the eyelet placement guide on the pattern, cut it out with scissors, and this is optional. If you don't want to add eyelets, you can skip ahead. Chalk out the eyelet placement guide on the right sides of both hood panels. Depending on what tools you're working with, you can either punch out these holes or snip them with scissors. When it comes to the size eyelet, you can really use whatever size you want. I'm using a smaller standard size. If you are working with a stretchy fabric, I do recommend backing it with a midway interfacing, or the alternative to interfacing is using little plastic washers. These came with the eyelets I'm using. I'm not sure which one works better between the interfacing and the washers, but I'm going to use the washers for this project. I put it on the eyelet. Feed the eyelet into your opening from the right side. Add one more plastic washer and the back end of your eyelet. To install it, I'm going to be using a hammer die. You can either use a hammer die or a press. Typically, the hammer die will come with the eyelets. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is place the front of the eyelet in the center of the base. Using the small rod, we're going to place it on the back side of the eyelet and hammer it down. And as you can see, when you use those plastic washers, it doesn't rip out of the fabric when you stretch it. I prefer these over the interfacing because it makes the process a little bit faster. Proceed on to the second hood panel and do the exact same thing. Feed the eyelet into the opening, add your back, and hammer it down. With both eyelets installed, we can place the hood panel to the side and grab the middle hood panel. We'll be starting with the main fabric, so you can place a secondary fabric off to the side. Going along with the middle hood panel, we're going to be grabbing our hood panels. Just like the middle hood panels, we can place the secondary fabric off to the side. Locate the back edge on the hood panel and the longer edge on the middle hood panel. These are the edges we're going to be connecting the panels together, and it's going to be going on a kind of a curve when you're sewing that middle hood panel onto the back edge of the hood panel. We'll be sewing one hood panel at a time, so place the right side of the middle hood panel on the back edge of the hood panel and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I typically don't use pins when I'm sewing on a curve like this. I just kind of sew it as I go. Double check to see if it's a stitch all the way through and there's no openings. If it's looking good, we're going to move to the opposite side of that middle hood panel. Grab the hood panel and do the exact same thing on the opposite side of the middle hood panel. Place the right sides together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Check all the way through the stitch, make sure there's no openings. If everything is looking good, we're going to flip around to the right side and we're going to be adding a top stitch. So locate the seam allowance for both of the new seams, fold the seam allowance towards the center of the middle hood panel and add your top stitch. I do recommend using an edge presser foot or matching the thread with the color of your fabric to hide any imperfections. And again, the top stitching is optional. If you don't want to add it, you don't have to. From here, we can place this panel off to the side and grab the secondary fabric for the middle hood panel and the hood panel. And we're going to assemble this part of the hood the exact same way. We're going to place the right sides together, lining up the back edge and the long edge, stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to jump right into adding the second hood panel to the opposite side of the middle hood panel. Just like with the main fabric, we're going to flip it around to the right side, fold the seam allowance towards the center of the middle hood panel, and add a top stitch. If you added a top stitch on your main fabric, I do recommend adding one to your secondary fabric as well. Give it one last look over. If everything is looking good, we can grab the main fabric and the secondary fabric. We're going to turn these into one hood panel by placing the right sides together, lining up the middle hood panel and the outside hood panels. I like to use the center seams as a guideline. I place a pin on both of those seams and on the bottom edges. Once it's perfectly lined up, we're going to add a stitch to that front edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, I like to double check to make sure that it's still lined up. That center hood panel is lined up, the seams are lined up. I'm going to flip the right sides out. Work my way around that front edge, lining up the main fabric and the secondary fabric. Depending on the fabric you're working with, it can move around a lot, so I recommend placing a few pins, and from here we're going to add a top stitch as close as we can to that front edge. And this is just a little trick if you're using two different color fabrics. Simply jump the fabric, keep stitching, and then go back, change the thread, and finish the center stitch. This is not necessary, but I like to match the thread to the color fabric. It just makes for a neater looking end product. Using the pattern, we're going to locate the hem guide on the hood panel. If you didn't add the eyelet, you can go ahead and skip this step. And you can mark this guide on the hood assembly, or you can just free stitch it as you go. The main thing you want to keep in mind is you want to be on the outside of the eyelet because this is going to be the path for our drawstring. Just like the previous top stitch, I'm going to jump that center panel and keep stitching because I'm going to use a different thread for that center panel. Like I said before, as long as that stitch is on the outside of the eyelet, you're totally fine. This is going to become our hood panel assembly. Do one last look over. If everything is looking good, you can place this panel off to the side and grab the leash cover panel. This panel is optional. You don't have to make this, so if you don't want to make it, you can skip ahead. But it's super simple to make. What we're going to do is place the right sides together and stitch the outside edge, leaving the bottom indent edge open. And we're stitching at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, you can go ahead and snip the corners to reduce a little bit of that bulk to get more pointy edges. After that, flip the right sides out, use something sharp to poke out those corners. With the corners poked out, we're going to add a top stitch around the outside edge. And after finishing up the top stitch, we're going to double check to make sure everything is looking good. Keep in mind, we're not going to add the button to this panel yet. We're going to wait until we have this panel actually sewn on so we can get a more accurate layout for the button. But anyways, place this panel off to the side and grab your pocket panel. Adding a pocket to the jacket is optional, so if you don't want to add one, you can skip ahead. It is super easy to add and make, so what we're going to do is locate the bottom edge. This is the edge we're not going to sew, so place the right sides together and stitch the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving the bottom edge unstitched. When it comes to stitching the corners, I like to stitch all the way through and then start the next stitch. Feel free to snip the corners to reduce the bulk and then pull the right sides out. Use something pokey to pop out the corners and get them looking nice. The main fabric and the secondary fabric outside edge and add a top stitch. I do recommend looking into an edge presser foot because it can keep these top stitches at a unified length throughout your project. Since this is a pocket, you can add more decorative stitches on the top edge, the side edges, or even make a design in the middle. But anyways, place this panel off to the side and grab your pocket flat panel. We'll be doing the same thing within this step. We're going to leave that top edge unstitched, so place the right sides together and add a stitch around the bottom edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And if you're not making the pocket panel, you don't have to make the pocket flap. After finishing up the stitch, double check to make sure all the layers got stitched together, and from here we're going to flip the right sides out, poke all the corners out, and add a top stitch to the outside edge. And again, I highly recommend matching your thread color to your fabric color for the best results. Double check both sides, make sure everything is looking good, and just like the leash cover panel, we're not going to add the snap button just yet. At this point, you can grab both the flat panel and the pocket panel. This step is optional, it's just one of those extra little details. We're going to be cleaning up that raw edge by adding a serge. If you don't have a serger, you can get very similar results by zigzag stitching directly on that edge. This is going to prevent future fraying when we add it onto the jacket. You can place these panels off to the side and grab your main panel. Also grab your complete hood assembly. Turn the main panel so the right side is facing up, chalk out a mark in the center of the neckline, and do the same in the center of the hood assembly. This is going to help keep the hood centered. Before we sew it on, grab the leash cover panel and place it in between the hood and the main panel with the wrong side facing down. Place the right side of the hood directly on top. And really quick, when it comes to the size of the hood, you can actually use any size hood as long as it fits on that neckline. So if you're looking to make the hood bigger or smaller, as long as it fits on that neckline, you're good to go. Since we are sewing on a very curved edge, I like to sew as I'm going, so I only place the pin in the center to help keep me lined up as I'm going. Feel free to use whatever technique works best for you, but we're going to be sewing as close as we can to the edge because this is just a placement stitch. Essentially, we're just getting the hood and the leash cover in place so it doesn't move around as we're sewing everything together. It's a good way to keep everything aligned, and of course double check to make sure it still is centered. If everything is looking good, we're going to move into the next step. This next step, we're going to be adding the secondary fabric to the main fabric. Place the right sides together, lining up the outside edges. I like to use the corners and the seams as a guideline because this ends up being a very long stitch and you want it to stay lined up as you're sewing. With the pins in place, we're going to be stitching all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving a gap at the bottom end open. You can make this opening anywhere from 2 to 4 inches. You just need enough room so you can pull everything back out through that opening. The smaller you go, the easier it is to clean up when you pull the right sides out, but the harder it is to pull through the opening. But anyways, feel free to start your stitch anywhere along that outside edge. Just keep in mind to jump that spot once you get to that bottom edge. Take your time and go slow. Try to make this stitch as neat as possible. The nicer you make this inside stitch, the nicer it's going to look when you flip the right sides out. As you come up on the opening, make sure you add a back tack, jump your space, and then add a back tack and keep on stitching. If your layers are becoming uneven as you're sewing, double check the pressure on your presser foot, loosen up the pressure, and keep on stitching and the layers should even out. After finishing up the stitch, go around the outside edge, make sure all the layers got stitched together. It's very crucial to double check because you don't want to flip it all the way right sides out and then find out there's an opening and then you have to go all the way back inside. But once you checked and you're satisfied, locate the opening on the bottom edge and flip the right sides out. And this can take a little bit of time, but you want to go around that edge and pop out all of the corners. Work your way to the bottom edge and find the opening. Roll both of the opening edge layers in so the right sides are touching. Place a few pins so the layers don't shift around. With the opening sealed off, the next thing we're going to do is add a top stitch all the way around that outside edge. And I highly recommend adding this top stitch all the way around the outside edge because it's really going to keep these layers unified. Not adding that top stitch will allow these layers to move freely and essentially bring that secondary layer out, so that way the edge is not really defined. But anyways, once you loop around to that leash cover panel, you can either go over it or under it. I chose to go under it just because I was using a green thread, but you can go over it if you like. In this step 2, you want to go slow, take your time, try to make this stitch as neat as possible. And since I skipped the blue stomach strap panels, I switched the thread and went back and added my top stitch. If you're only using one color fabric, you can stitch all the way through. With the top stitch out of the way, we pretty much completed all the hard steps of this jacket. And like I was saying before, with this top stitch here, you can take that edge and it's not going to flip over on itself. It's essentially keeping these two layers separate. And once we add that pocket, it's going to really lock these layers together. Fold the jacket in half, lining up the back edge on the fold, place the pattern on top, and locate the pocket placement guide. This is just a reference. You can actually place this pocket wherever you want on that back edge. But either way, mark the pocket placement guide with chalk, lay the jacket out with right sides facing up, check your markings to see if they're in the center back, grab the pocket panel and place it in between both of the markings. Based on the size and adjustments you made to your jacket, you can just kind of move this pocket around to where you think looks best. Once you found the sweet spot, we're going to roll the bottom edge of the pocket over so the right sides are touching, add a few pins, and stitch that bottom edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Roll the pocket back over so the wrong side of the pocket is touching the right side of the jacket. Place a few pins, and from here we're going to add a top stitch around the outside edge, leaving that top edge open, because that top edge is going to be the opening of the pocket. And take your time, you want this stitch to look neat as possible because it's going to be front and center. And there you have it, your pocket is attached. Feel free to add more tack stitches up towards that top edge of the pocket because that's where most of the strain is going to happen. Moving on, grab the pocket flap panel, and we're going to install this panel the same exact way. I like to fold the leash cover down so that way I can find the correct placement for the flap panel. You want to give yourself enough room up top so you can make your hole for the leash cover. And you can place it pretty much anywhere above the pocket. You can have it flap over the pocket more or less, it's up to you. Once you found that sweet spot, stitch it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Roll the pocket flap over and add a top stitch just to that top edge. After finishing up the stitch, double check to see if it's still centered over the pocket. If everything is looking good, your pocket is installed. And this is a super simple pocket design, and you can see that you can make it bigger, smaller, you really have that whole back area to work with. Moving on to installing the snap buttons, using the pattern you can see that we have one directly in the center of that flap panel. I'm actually going to switch that up and show you that you can really add these snap buttons wherever you want on that flat panel. I'm going to be adding 2 instead of 1. I like to mark out the placement with chalk so that way I can move it around if I need to get a perfect alignment. The main goal is to align it with the pocket panel and the flap panel. Just like installing the eyelets, you can either snip or punch the holes. I'm going to be using a standard snap button. These typically come in kits and they're very easy to install. I'll be grabbing the flat outside portion to install first. This is going to go on my flap panel. Through your opening with the flat button on the right side of the fabric. Just like with the eyelets, I'll be installing this with the hammer die. It came with the kit. It's super easy to use. Place the base on the button side, put the rod in the opening and hammer it down. The jacket back over so the right side is facing up. Put the pocket flap panel down on top of the pocket panel and see where that top button falls. Mark that exact point with chalk. This is going to be where we install the opposite side of the snap button. Feed the long end in through the wrong side, add the cap on the right side. Using the die, hammer it into position. And it's really that simple. It doesn't take a lot to install these snap buttons, and in the end they turn out really nice looking. Snap it together, test it out, see if it lines up perfectly. If everything looks good, we're going to move to the other side and install the other snap button. Like I said before, feel free to add as many buttons as you want or place them in different areas. It's really up to you and whatever look you're going for. Next, we're going to move up to the leash cover panel and install one button so it's not flapping around. I like to place it as close as I can to the outside edge. That way it gives you enough room to add your hole underneath for your leash to go through. Just like in the previous steps, we're going to fold that leash panel down and see where that snap button falls, mark that area, and add the second half of the button. And I do recommend testing these after you install them just to make sure everything sits flat and is lined up. Moving on, we're going to install one more button up on the hood, and this is going to be the button that keeps that hood down so it's not flopping around as your pet's running. I found the best spot was in between the leash cover and the pocket flap panel, directly in the center. Mark the back of the jacket and the hood where they meet up. Before you add the snap button, you definitely want to move the hood back and kind of push and feel, see if it lines up, if everything is looking good. Add your snap button and test it out. And when it comes to these snap buttons, you don't need to add them, but it does help keep the hood from flapping around, and all in all, it's just a nice detail to add onto the jacket. Next, fold the jacket in half, and we're going to be adding our Velcro, starting with the stomach strap at the bottom. And this is where you can add another layer of custom adjustments. Because we're going to be using Velcro, I'm using 1.5 inch width Velcro. I found this was a very nice width. You can go wider and you can go more narrow. I also cut them into two 4-inch strips. This is because I didn't want them to extend past the strap panel. When it comes to placing them, one is going to go on the wrong side of the strap panel and one is going to go on the right side of the strap panel. This is going to allow them to overlap. So if you make these Velcro strips longer, you can have a lot of room of adjustment and really tighten it up under your pet. And that's going to really help you fine tune the pattern to that exact size. I'm using Velcro with an adhesive back. This way I can stick it on and kind of test it out before I stitch it down. It's not necessary, but it's very helpful when you're trying to find that perfect placement. From here, we're going to stitch around the outside edge as close as we can to that edge. Just like the Velcro, if you match the thread to the color of Velcro, it's going to hide that stitch and make it look really nice. And at this point, you can have your pet try it on to see if you need to make further adjustments or add a bigger strip of Velcro. I only stitch the outside edges of the Velcro. Most of the time you stitch a box or an X in the middle. With the bottom straps done, we're going to move to the front neckline and add our straps there. And essentially, we're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to overlap the panels, figure out exactly where we want this Velcro to go. Once you found the sweet spot, we're going to add Velcro to the right side and the wrong side. Quickly try it out to make sure everything is lined up and those front panels are looking good. And then from here, we're going to stitch it down. The more stitches you add to the Velcro, the stronger it will be and the longer it will last. After finishing up both sides, test it out, make sure everything is still lined up and looking good. Feel free to go back and make adjustments, but we're going to keep moving on, and the next step is adding our leash opening. Lift up the leash cover, grab the pattern, and find a good spot to add this opening. You mainly want it to fall under the leash cover, so find that spot, mark it out with chalk. We're going to be using the button presser foot to make this opening. I found this was a super easy way to do it, and it gives you a lot of room to customize it to your exact leash size. Because working with these button presser foots, you can adjust them to make the hole bigger or smaller, and that's exactly what we're going to do. An easy way to do this is to lay the presser foot out on the jacket and adjust it to the width of the leash cover. Keep in mind you don't want the hole any bigger than the leash cover, so try to keep it within that size. Once you have the presser foot adjusted to the size you want to work with, to your machine and pull down the buttonhole lever located to the left of your presser foot. Adjust the stitch pattern dial to the buttonhole. This is typically the one that looks like a rectangle. And finally, move up to the stitch length and adjust it to the buttonhole. Every machine is a little bit different, so I highly recommend testing it out a few times before you do it on your jacket. And with the buttonhole installed, all we have to do now is to cut a slit in between both of those stitch lines. Be very careful, use sharp scissors, and try not to cut any of the actual stitches. If you're looking to make these on a larger scale, I highly recommend looking into a buttonhole machine. But with the opening cut, you can see that this is where your leash can go into. You can make it wider, smaller, and pretty much adjust it to the size of your leash. And like I said before, this step is optional. You don't need to add this opening. Moving on, next we're going to add our drawstring into the eyelets. I'll be using a nylon paracord. I like using this on all my projects that require cord because it's strong and you can get it in a lot of different looks. And all we're doing is feeding the cord into the eyelet and out the other eyelet. This does take quite a bit of time. You can use a safety pin to kind of guide it through, but my eyelets were a little bit too small. Trim the cord to your preference and add your cord stoppers. If you feel like your pet is going to chew on the cord stoppers, you don't need to add them. Add a safety knot underneath the cord stopper. Essentially, it's going to prevent that cord stopper from sliding off. Trim the ends. And lastly, if you're using nylon cord, you can light the ends to prevent it from fraying. That's another big reason I like using nylon, because you can really clean up the ends nicely. Just like that, your drawstring is complete. And the last detail you want to add is your branding. I used a little piece of leather that I branded and added with double-sided rivets. And you can add them anywhere you want on the jacket. That is going to complete the jacket. When it comes to the sizing of the pocket, you can adjust that. That's a really easy thing to customize. Also, the length, that back edge can be moved really easy along with that front neckline. You can move that back and forth. Same with the bottom strap. And these are the things you really want to do to get that perfect fitting jacket for your pet. If you're taking the time to make it, you might as well take the time to get the correct measurements and make it right. And there you have it, your pet jacket is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Hopefully your jackets turned out awesome, whether you're making a hoodie style or a jacket style. I would love to see what you come up with, so tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing. But until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, and I'll see you next time.